The chimes of a children's song filled the street as a cream-painted ice cream truck drove through the bumpy terrain. Debris and risen dust fill the road ahead. The sides of the streets were filled with tattered buildings and bombing sites. The streets were empty, but you could feel the presence around. Their eyes lurking behind their slightly parted curtains of dirty windows, watching through crooked corners and shadowy alleyways. The air was thick with death and depression. The van stopped in front of a huge building. The damage to it was much less than that to the others around it, in that it still had its roof and its structure still stood firmly. Save for a huge hole in the wall, which had recently been barricaded with iron bars, the doors of the van slid open, and a lady peeked out. Her head was wrapped with a light satin scarf, and her eyes were hidden behind dark shades. She looked left and then right, taking her time to scan her environment before leaning back in and stepping down from the van. She hurried to the black gates that fenced the Oxblood building. Her hands folded into a tight knuckle as she tapped against the gate in a repetitive pattern. The gate slid open, and a little girl appeared behind it. The woman smiled as she leaned down and hugged the girl, before walking inside with her. They walked past some men who stood around, chatting and cleaning. She greeted them as they nodded at her with cheerful smiles. The woman walked to the door of the building, then turned to the left and looked into a keyhole which was lodged into the wall. She took off her glasses. The device beeped as it released sensors that scanned her irises before chiming in confirmation of her identity. The floor beneath her split into a detached circle and began to descend in a slow spiral. It landed in front of two metal doors that slid open to reveal a room filled with people moving from one point to the other, devotion to their destinations in their eyes. There were mutual feelings of fear and desperation running through each person's eyes as their badges, which showed that they were law enforcement, bounced against their bodies as they moved. A man in his mid-40s walked up to her. His sleeves were folded carelessly, and his hair a tousled mess as the eye bags beneath his reddening eyes told tales of his sleepless nights.
Commander Lysander! It's great you could finally make it!
The man stretched out his hands to the woman. She took off her scarf and shades, confirming her identity before taking his hands into hers. It had been nearly 5 months since the Psychos joined forces with the Deviants and began to wreak havoc on the entire planet. Their starship, the Bluefly, put them at a great advantage to continue their tyranny for so long. It was untraceable and could not be seen at all the moment its camouflage was turned on. Their attacks were unpredictable and merciless. In the span of a month, they had torn through Lost Islands and the rest of the surrounding cities. But we finally had an edge. Their last attack had been on the West District of New Haven Society, and they had left the city in ruins. But no one ever saw them leave, and since then, they hadn't been heard from. The covert units had found some weird heat signals using their drones and alerted Aria immediately. And now she was here, the rest of her team on their way. She knew where they were, and this time she wasn't going to hesitate in pulling the trigger. Not after everything that had happened recently. She couldn't stop the constant guilt that beat alongside her heart whenever she thought of the Deviants and all the destruction they had caused. No matter how she tried not to think of it, she felt like she was the cause of everything. If only she had pulled the trigger that day, things would have turned out a lot differently. But instead, she allowed her emotions to get the best of her. Because she felt she had to make up for her mistake, she had spent the past 6 months on a wild goose chase for the criminals. even went as far as arguing with her superior after she was asked to stand down due to her emotional attachment. There was no way they could handle the Psychos without her, and she knew that. So, she told them in a very angry manner. But she couldn't be bothered to care about anything else. She had to find her sister and her gang at any cost and bring them to justice. The murder count had increased drastically. Their crimes could not be pardoned.
I hope the journey wasn't too bumpy.
The man called out, pulling me out of my swirling thoughts. I turned to him with a sober look on my face.
Not as much as it was depressing. It's complete chaos out there.
He shrugged.
Just like every other attack, this one caught us completely off guard, even after all of our efforts to be prepared for them. They wiped the place off the map in seconds. Our surface troops tried their best to stop them, but it was all a wreck. As usual, we were supposed to serve as backup, but instead, we were given direct orders to remain here.
Direct orders from who?
The governor.
And where is he right now?
North District. He's having a meeting with the military right now. They're said to join us any moment from now.
All right, so we'll wait for them before we engage. We could really use that backup. What do you guys know so far?
Well, we think they may have stopped to rest the ship. It runs on solar energy in our atmosphere, but it needs a total of 24 hours to charge.
Do you have men stationed at the location?
He nodded.
We've got snipers surrounding the building they're at. They've locked them in.
Good. They must remember to stay hidden and wait for us. They should only engage if it's completely necessary.
Well, that's where we have a problem, Commander. The officers here have all lost a lot to those monsters. I fear they may not be patient enough, as they may not understand how delicate this mission is.
Aria nodded, feeling the guilt again, but swallowing it as she took in his words. She expected it. Everyone, even surviving civilians, was praying to get their own pound of flesh from the deviants. Anyone who saw the opportunity would need to be extremely disciplined to wait for orders without taking their shot. And nobody was that disciplined.
Which means it would be worse when the military gets here.
Well, inasmuch as they're North District military, the West District was always welcoming and had the most visitors from other districts. I'm sure some of them lost their family members on such visits.
She sighed, knowing there was only one thing she had to do. Her team had been specially built to the detail, every member playing a specific role, and combining practiced strategies which had now become like muscle memory to them. And they had one simple rule: no family. They were required to cut off ties with their family members and prohibited from forming new ones. The only family they had were themselves. It was that policy that had caused a rift between Aria and Sasha. She felt like Aria had let her work consume her, and that she had chosen it over her own sister. Aria had tried to explain to her how fast the world was changing, and how it needed people who were ready to drop everything and protect it, but that was too much for a 12-year-old to understand. Aria had no choice but to leave her, and Sasha hated her for it. Eventually, her hate spread to the police force, and then everything that stood for good. She got mingled up with the wrong set of people. She got into the worst types of petty crimes, and each time she was caught, Aria tried to come speak to her, but she would barely look at her. It didn't stop Aria from bailing her out. She was worried for her sister, but she was confident that somewhere along the line, Sasha would begin to come to her senses. But then she got married to an abusive, drug-dealing piece of shit, and everything changed. She got into more vile crimes, but this time the police weren't the ones catching her. She was catching them. She'd let her hatred consume her, and by her second year in the marriage, she'd completely lost it. and had committed over 36 violent crimes against police officers and their families. Her husband died very suspiciously after her 3rd year in the marriage, leaving her with a huge sum of money as an inheritance. And what did she do with it? Start a fucking gang.